Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Colin Halverson. I'm a researcher at Indiana University School of Medicine, and I'm faculty in the Center for Biomedical Ethics there. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the Diagnostic Odyssey, which is a term that we use to refer to the time period between when a patient begins to seek a diagnosis for their symptoms until the point where they actually receive a diagnosis from a clinician. I have no disclosures relevant to this particular talk, but I am currently funded in large part by a career development award from the NHGRI at NIH to study Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. A brief outline of my talk today. I'm going to begin with some methodology, not just for the smaller study on which the majority of this talk is based, but also looking at the methods that I've used for a number of studies that emerged from that initial study, data from which I will also be referring to throughout the discussion. The rest of the talk will really look at the Diagnostic Odyssey. In particular, in the initial study, we referred to what's called the hero's journey, which is a narrative framework, as a way of understanding how patients make meaning out of their diagnostic course. And I've used some titles copied from that framework, which you can see here, and I'll discuss each of those in turn. Then I will look at the iatrogenic harms or the dangers and damages caused by clinical care over the course of the Diagnostic Odyssey before turning to future care and where I believe there are the most critical needs for future interventions into the diagnostic course for these patients. So first, some methods. I am a PhD trained medical and linguistic anthropologist, and as I've mentioned, I'm a professor of medical ethics. So that's my background that I brought to this series of interviews. The initial publication was based on just 21 interviews, but that was 4 years ago. And over that time, I've continued to follow this cohort of patients and grow this cohort, and have now done a total of 56 of these Diagnostic Odyssey interviews. These interviews are based methodologically in what's called narrative medicine and illness narratives. So these are very in-depth qualitative studies looking at a wide range of patient experiences. Since this initial study, I've done 4 further in-depth interview studies on a range of topics with patients, including the use of complementary and alternative medicine, their understanding of the pain scale that's used to assess subjective symptoms, as well as experience of trauma. I've also conducted a number of short surveys with the same cohort, but I've 2 years ago conducted a large survey with 505 unique respondents from the Ehlers-Danlos Society Global Registry that I will also be drawing on heavily. Some demographics from the interviews. The main thing that I want to highlight on this slide is the gender aspect for 2 reasons. One, this is fairly representative of what we know about patients who end up receiving an hEDS diagnosis. They're largely female identifying. The other reason that I want to bring this up is because we know from the literature that female-bodied individuals are less likely to have their pain taken seriously by clinicians. This is something that becomes highly relevant to patient experience, and I will discuss that more later. Some more demographics. Here, I primarily want to note that there is a large percentage of patients who are unable to maintain full-time employment as they desire due to disability. Same thing with educational attainment, although I will also note that this is actually a fairly well-educated patient population. And now a little bit more information on the hero's journey. The hero's journey, also known as the monomyth, was a narrative framework developed by the American scholar of comparative myth, Joseph Campbell, primarily represented in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is now considered a classic. in my home discipline of anthropology. During his research, Campbell examined cultural myths and stories from around the world in order to understand the type of narrative framework most often used to structure these types of stories. We use this in our initial study to better understand the way that patients narrativize their experiences along the Diagnostic Odyssey and how they make meaning out of the struggles and triumphs of those experiences. And so, as you will see, our verbiage reflects Campbell's narrative categories, which are laid out in this image here. Each of these steps, at least in some way, is represented in these narratives that we found from patients on their Diagnostic Odyssey, many of which I will discuss in somewhat more detail as we go forward. So first, crossing the threshold from what's called the everyday world, so the world before a patient starts to have symptoms considered related to Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and into the Diagnostic Odyssey. So here are some data based on our large survey of 505 respondents from around the world. The most common reason by far that patients begin to seek a diagnosis for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is pain, chronic pain. Then you can see also, to a lesser extent, fatigue, dislocations, hypermobility, and dizziness and fainting. The other thing that I want to mention on this at this point is, along the course of the Diagnostic Odyssey, this is the first moment that patients start to recognize that their symptoms are something that needs to be managed, or at least needs to be named. However, after the fact, patients often come to look back at moments in their life before they cross the threshold and see other behaviors, activities, experiences that they had not understood to be clinically relevant as symptomatic, as harbingers of a future diagnosis of EDS. And these things include everything from how they sit, doing the splits, sitting on the ground, how they, the amount of back pain or stomach pain, et cetera, that they experience that they had previously interpreted as simply normal or a part of their normal experience. As they cross this threshold, they move into what is called in the monomyth the road of challenges. The most prominent and probably the first of these are the psychosocial sequelae of the primary physical issues that we just addressed that led them to begin their Diagnostic Odyssey in the first place. These issues play a significant role in the patient's daily lives. These include others' doubt in the validity of their experiences and the validity of their symptoms. This isn't just clinician doubt. This includes the doubt of loved ones, spouses, children, friends, etc. This doubt from all sides leads patients to self-doubt, not only their ability to express their pain, but their ability to assess their pain in the first place. This also leads to social isolation, which has its own broad-ranging physical consequences, and ultimately may lead some patients to have a mistrust of other people in general. These also have long-term consequences for the patient's trajectory beyond the world of health. Chronic symptoms and disability result primarily because of a lack of treatments and a lack of appropriate care. Many of the patients I've spoken with have at least at some point dropped out or limited their high school or college experiences because their symptoms have become too disabling. Many have changed career goals because their initial dreams felt too burdensome given their increasing disability. And relatedly, many have abandoned hobbies and athletic pursuits that had previously been critical to their maintenance of mental health and well-being. Clinicians, unsurprisingly, often lack knowledge of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, as it is understood to be a rare disease. This leads many patients to be misdirected and given misdiagnoses. These here are based on our large patient survey. These are the most common of what we call co-diagnoses. So these are diagnoses that are either supplementary to or in contrast to an hEDS diagnosis. This lack of knowledge on the part of clinicians lengthens the diagnostic odyssey of patients well beyond the average length of time for a patient with rare disease, so that hEDS patients often, or on average, wait over 10 years to receive an appropriate diagnosis. During this time, their symptoms worsen and they remain without appropriate care. This results in worse health outcomes. This is not just because their diagnostic course lasts longer, but also because clinicians often, without understanding and without ill intention, recommend inappropriate behaviors and care for these patients. This is based on another set of interviews that we did looking at patient trauma. These negative encounters relate both to a misunderstanding and to the clinician's doubt in the patient's expression of their symptoms. After, on average, 10.53 years, the patient will receive a diagnosis. The vast majority of patients receive this diagnosis as a sort of catharsis in their narrative. While the delay has been a huge burden both on them, on the healthcare system, they experience enormous psychological relief and a reduction of anxiety as a result of getting this diagnosis. This also allows them to improve their understanding of their symptoms and their understanding of their prognosis, allowing them to better prepare for what they believe the future will hold for them. There's a significant amount of iatrogenic harm that results from the long diagnostic odyssey. While often well-intentioned, unknowledgeable care can be very harmful to patients. The doubt that clinicians express in their patients' ability to represent their own experiences legitimately can lead many patients to experience a sort of trauma. We have a whole paper looking at this and is a significant issue for the patient's well-being. As we saw on an earlier slide, this trauma leads many patients to avoid clinical care altogether and to avoid describing their diagnosis to their patients for fear of stigma and bias. The clinician, therefore, is doubly disadvantaged, presumably often not having as much education EDS as they would a more common disease, but then also not having access to even what the patient understands about his or her own diagnosis and condition. This avoidance often results in patients having untreated pain, and with a lack of treatment and a lack of appropriate treatments even available for clinicians, should they be knowledgeable enough to offer any, patients often turn to complementary and alternative medical techniques to manage their symptoms. Many of those things patients do understand to be successful ways to manage their pain, but the problem is that they often undertake these things without the oversight of physicians and without appropriate evidencing of these modalities. Finally, looking at where we go from here, as we've seen, the primary concerns that patients have are of pain, fatigue, dislocations, and dizziness. All of these are amenable to intervention, at least to some extent, but the way that they are presented are insufficient for what I'm calling the 3 A's. They're insufficient in terms of availability, awareness, and access. And so it's my belief that the next step really is we need to improve and validate therapies to manage these primary concerns for this patient population. And additionally, we need better research on CAM modalities, complementary and alternative medical techniques, so that we make sure that what is being offered is what should be offered, it's being offered when it should be, and it's being monitored so that patients don't feel like they can't discuss these types of topics with their clinicians. Thank you very much.